Hi, welcome to session 10. This one is an introduction to the principles of flight. There are a few prerequisites we need for gliding flight. If you imagine you're standing on a cliff edge and you're going to jump off it, if you have some piece of equipment that weighs about 8 kilos, like a mountain bike or something like that, it's not going to do any good. You're going to go hurtling down and crash on the rocks below. But if you have an 8 kilo paraglider, you'll be able to glide from it. So starting right from the beginning, why would that be the case? What is it about the paraglider or the hang glider, whatever it is that we use, that enables us to fly? So we have a few prerequisites. The first one is we have to have a reasonably large surface area. Clearly, the bigger the area, the more drag is created, and that's going to reduce the rate at which we fall. It's the basis of the sort of parachute technology, of course. So that's one thing. So you can see here, I've just done a little diagram here, just showing a bit of area. The next thing we need in order to glide, actually to move forward instead of go straight down, is we need some airspeed. So we need to be moving forward. So you have to be able to travel through the air at an angle. So airspeed. And the third thing that we need is the suitable angle of attack. The angle of attack, technical term, is just basically where the relative airflow is striking the surface that we're going to use, our wing in our case. If you have all these three things in place, you have a big enough area with the right airspeed and the right angle of attack, then we can get gliding flight. However, even that is fairly tricky to organise, because a flat plate doesn't glide very well. So what we do is we use a slightly curved plate and curved into an aerofoil section. Why is that? Well, it's fairly simple. That basically you get an air mass that's moving, and whether it's the air mass moving or the actual wing moving through the air, it doesn't matter, but an air flow. If you try and make air change direction suddenly, or make a sharp change of direction, it just breaks away. It's not very efficient. But if you have a curve, you can actually persuade it to sort of stick to the curve as it goes around. So you persuade it around the bend, if you see what I mean. So having a slightly curved surface gives us a wider range of angles of attack at which it will work without actually the airflow breaking away in a stall. So we now really have the adequate area, the airspeed, the angle of attack, and ideally a suitable aerofoil shape as well. So we'll take a look at this. This is obviously very basic stuff. So here's a flat plate which is in a smoke tunnel, and you can see that it does generate a little bit of low pressure above, but only a few degrees, and the air breaks away above it. So that's a flat plate. However, we have an aerofoil shaped like this. We can angle it up to quite a few degrees, and you notice how the smoke streams there adhere to the top surface smoothly. And that's what we're after. So we get a decent range of angles of attack at which it works. So that means we can glide at different speeds. Right, aerofoils, they come in all shapes and sizes. You can see we've got a variety here from different kinds of gliders, but they all have one thing in common, and they have that curved surface so that the air is persuaded to change direction gradually. They have different properties, which we won't need to go into at this stage. What I've also put is a little picture here of a single surface paraglider at the end here. As mentioned here, that does have a curved over bit at the front, but the same single surface. Like early hang gliders were just single surface, and they still work as aerofoils. The angle of attack. So what is that exactly? In terms of aerofoils, we can draw a theoretical line from the centre of the trailing edge through the middle of the leading edge of the aerofoil. Leading edge must be in the front, trailing edge being in the back. So the line through that is the chord line, and it's the angle between the relative airflow, so the direction that thing is travelling, the flight path if you like, and that chord line is the angle of attack. And it has to be within a certain range. In terms of hang gliders and paragliders, our range is somewhere, we usually fly at about 12, 13, 14 degrees angle of attack. That's quite small. If you start going up and have a high angle of attack, then the airflow still can't adhere to the top surface and it breaks up. When we're talking about paragliders, of course, an aerofoil is something we have to build on the ground because we've got the whole thing stuffed in a bag. So we use the ram air principle, and be aware of this, the actual ribs inside a paraglider are cut in an aerofoil section where it's got a top and bottom surface, and this supports that curved top surface and flatter lower surface. And the whole thing remains solid by dint of air pressure. So as it's moving along with its airspeed, Not only do you need the airspeed to generate the lift, it needs the airspeed to maintain internal pressure so that you've actually got your wing built, as it were, the airfoil itself. So that's ram air canopy. Now we're going to look at how an aerofoil basically works. So we need to know about two things here, the venturi effect and Bernoulli's theorem. The venturi effect is where you restrict the flow of a gas or a liquid. For example, in this example here, it's going through a restricted space in a tube, something like that. What happens is, in the restricted area, it speeds up, it accelerates. Easy way to visualize is squeezing the end of a hose pipe. You make the gap smaller and the water speeds up as it goes through. So that's what happens. And that's the venturi effect, basically. You give it a restricted area and you get acceleration. And then allied to this, you have Bernoulli's theorem, which is when you accelerate a gas or a liquid, the pressure drops. Right, this was discovered a very long time ago, but as far as we're concerned, it's vital, because the pressure dropping where it accelerates means that as the air flows over the top of our aerofoil, where it accelerates, which we'll get to in just a moment, the pressure drops, and that helps to generate some lift, which produces a much better glide than if we're just using a flat plate as well. So here we are, trying to show you how it goes. Now obviously we haven't got a tube, we've only got a curved surface at the bottom. But we still have atmospheric pressure pushing down from the top. The whole body of air is still trying to go in the same direction as it's interrupted. So we still get acceleration over the top of the aerofoil, over the top of the camber, as we call it, which is the curve in the top surface. And this is how it looks. We've got a little smoke tunnel here, and this one's got interrupted flow in the smoke. So if you see that, you can actually notice that the flow over the top is faster than the flow underneath. And it illustrated at the freeze frame at the end here. You can see the interruption at the end has reached the trailing edge before it has underneath. So we've accelerated the airflow over the top, and then it's not by a great deal, but it's enough to lower the pressure significantly, and that helps us generate lift. Right, so that's how the aerofoil works. We can adjust our angle of attack now so that we can actually change the amount of lift that's generated. We have a higher angle of attack, say 15 degrees or something like that. We generate quite a lot of venturi and lower pressure above, so that we can generate quite a bit. If you have a lower one, then we do less. So we can modify that angle of attack as we fly along, which gives us speed range effectively. On a paraglider, we've got two ways of doing that. If you pull down on the brakes and you add drag on the trailing edge of the canopy, if you actually look up, you can see the leading edge go back very slightly. So it's a very subtle change to the angle of attack. A more dramatic change is if you use a foot-operated accelerator system and you push that out and you actually shorten the front risers compared to the rear rise, and the whole thing tilts down a few degrees, which obviously makes us go faster. You can't fly a paraglider in particular at a very low angle of attack because we rely on the air pressure and so forth, and because they're very soft, they tend to collapse or pitch downwards, and then the aerofoil doesn't work very well. So we've got a limited range of angle of attack between it being too low, where it won't go any faster, and too high, where the airflow breaks away over the top. Okay, most student pilots have done this on the ground. It's easy to change your angle of attack on the ground, although all the lines are the right length, so the manufacturer set the angle of attack, if you like, to a trim speed. If you run forward and then you stop and let the paraglider go in front of you, obviously the angle of attack gets lower, and we all know what happens next. We get a collapse. So that's angle of attack and how we adjust it. So I mentioned there, if the angle of attack gets too high, the airflow breaks away over the top. So this picture here is of a stalled aerofoil. A good way to visualize this is as a liquid. If we imagine a smooth curved rock in a stream, like a weir, the water will flow over it in a nice laminar angle, so it'll be nice and smooth. You've probably all seen this. But if you tilt it up more and more steeply, you eventually reach an angle where the water can't adhere anymore to that curvature, and it breaks up into white water. And exactly the same happens over an aerofoil when we stall it. If the angle of attack gets too high, the air mass, which has inertia, just cannot change direction that quickly, so it breaks up. And the chaotic flow over the top just destroys any lift that we may have. In actual fact, it usually starts at the trailing edge and sort of rushes up over the top surface, the chaotic flow, and massively reduces the amount of lift that the wing is able to produce. And with a paraglider, we've got an unusual thing compared to any other aircraft. When we do a full stall, not only do we stop our aerofoil from working properly, we then pack up our aerofoil. So I don't have an aircraft left at all. So it collapses like this. So unlike stalling any other aircraft, the stall on a paraglider is quite dramatic because we destroy our aircraft really and have to rebuild it before we carry on. So if we stall it, we lose the airspeed, we lose the lift, and then we lose our internal pressure as well. Okay. In the actual case of a paraglider, what happens is there's loads of drag on it, so you're the heavy thing underneath it, and when you stall it, pull it back, it actually falls back behind the pilot. And then because you're heavier, you swing back under it and it pitches back forwards again. So it starts this sort of rather uncontrolled system where it descends very rapidly because you've got no lift, we just have a little bit of drag left, but also it's uncontrolled in its mechanism, so it might come out pointing in another direction or it might partially collapse, things like that. So of flight, the actual practicality of it is we don't want to be stalling a paraglider anywhere near the ground. Essentially, stalling a paraglider in this way in a full or dynamic stall can lose hundreds of feet in altitude. So if you're at sort of 2,500 feet and you do it, you've got a good chance that you can recover it. If you're a metre off the ground or something, that doesn't matter either because it collapses and starts sinking and you drop and you're on the ground again. But if you're at 200 or 300 feet off the ground, or 500 feet even, and you stall the paraglider, you may very well have a rapid descent rate and be unable to recover before you hit the ground. Which is worth knowing because when you're an inexperienced pilot or you're a ridge soaring pilot, that's where we spend a lot of our time. So I'm sure all those who've been to a school instructor has impressed on you the fact that you do not slow down lower than a certain amount when mid-air, because if you go right down and hold it in a stall, as you do when you're landing, of course, when you flare it, and the glider does collapse, that will not be very good for your health. Fortunately, it's a pretty gross input and you have to hold it for sort of 3 seconds before it will go. So quite difficult to do by mistake. Okay, so that's the stall. The forces acting on an aerofoil. So principles, we need to understand how the whole thing works. So here we are. First of all, downwards we've got weight, just the mass of the planet's gravity is just pulling us vertically downwards. So that's our engine, if we like. But instead of falling straight down, as the old bicycle would do, because we now have an aerofoil, and if it's the right angle of attack, the right aerofoil section, and we've got the right airspeed, it will glide forward. It generates lift on a slightly upwards and forwards direction. In fact, the direction of the lift is at 90 degrees to the direction of travel. So the aerofoil is traveling like that, the lift will be at 90 degrees to it. Another force shown here is drag, and drag basically operates back the way you just came from, so it's directly opposite, 180 degrees to the direction of travel, and drag is what holds us back. The less drag we can get away with, the better. So those are the forces: the weight, the drag and the lift. If you actually combine all the force of the lift and the drag together, they form, see the dotted line here is the resultant, and that is always vertical or diametrically opposite the weight. So those are the forces on an aerofoil. We'll come back and revisit this later on in another session. Okay, so we end up with gliding flight. We end up with all the forces balanced, so our airfoil, instead of falling straight down like a parachute, will now actually slide forward. So it falls sideways, or we prefer the term glide. And as long as it has some weight which is pulling it down, and it can vector the force of that of gravity forwards, then we continue to glide. In the same way, the little picture here shows a bicycle going down a hill. It will actually use the hill to vector its direction, but with us, the aerofoil does that for us. Right, the other force I mentioned here was drag. So we've talked about lift, we all know what weight is. What is drag? Drag is the thing that holds us back, and it's resistance of the air to anything moving through it. So we've all stuck a hand out of a car window or felt the wind or whatever, you can feel the push against you. That's drag. In its simplest form, it just is profile drag, so anything in the air gets pushed on the front. There is resistance to the air flowing around you. But if you look at drag a little bit more closely, there are different elements of drag that operate in slightly different ways, which we'll also look at in a moment. But for the moment, there are two principal varieties that concern us. So the first one is profile drag, and profile drag is what I've just described. the wind pushing against you, simple as that. So if you turn sideways, you have a thinner profile, or in the case of a paraglider, you use thinner lines or a pod harness or something like that. You reduce the amount of profile drag. So we get rid of it by streamlining. We'll look at that in a moment. The other kind is induced drag. When the aerofoil is working and generating lift because the pressure is higher underneath than it is over the top, when you get out to the wingtips, we still have higher pressure underneath than we do on the top. We can eliminate it to some extent by twisting our aerofoil, a few things like that. But essentially it's like, going back to the stream analogy, if you put a rock in a stream and you have high pressure water on one side and low pressure behind it, it'll actually just curl around to fill up. And that's exactly what happens on the wingtip. The air actually just rotates around, and that's called induced drag. So we'll look at that as well. So profile drag, we can reduce it either just by having a small thing in the airflow so there isn't much of it, or by streamlining as best we can. And that's why the forward profile of a hang glider or paraglider is as slim as possible. We try and make it nice and smooth, thin lines, feet up, all that kind of thing. Or if you're a hang glider, you put aerofoil section tubes on your control frame, etc. Okay, induced drag then. Here's a diagram. So higher pressure below, lower pressure above, and at the wingtip it escapes around. I said there's a number of mechanisms, the curve down, all sorts of things, but that's essentially what happens. So as it's a bit like a boat going through the water, it actually leaves a vortex behind it. So as the wing flies along and the high pressure escapes to the low pressure, as it goes along, it leaves this vortex in the air as it goes along. And all aircraft do this to a greater or lesser extent. And here's a really nice picture of a bizjet having flown through a bit of cloud. And you can just see behind it here the vortices formed in the cloud from each wingtip. Okay. When you're flying in close proximity to another aircraft, you can feel these. So even on a paraglider, if you fly close in behind another paraglider, you can actually feel the kind of double bump as you fly over the water. It's a bit like water skiing over the wake of a boat, I guess. Normally it's not a big deal. But if you have a big heavy aircraft, and I'm talking about something large, sort of Hercules, something like that, there'll be enough force in the vortex to flip you upside down. So we also want to keep away from those. Even just flying with other paragliders, heavily laden or slow moving paragliders, and the worst offenders are dual paragliders, which obviously are heavily laden and bigger, can actually give quite a significant bump. So you can actually feel it. I've seen people get small collapses, tucks from flying close behind a tandem paraglider. So do watch out for it. You often will be flying around on a smooth day, nothing to worry about, and then suddenly you feel a bump, and it's because someone's just flown past upwind of you. Okay, so exercise caution if you're flying close to other aircraft, particularly anything big or heavy. Right, next subject is wind speed, airspeed and ground speed. So just a quick definitions. Wind speed is the speed the wind is blowing over the ground. The ground speed is the speed that you are travelling over the ground. And the airspeed is the speed that the air is travelling from the front to the back of your aerofoil. So why mention it? It's very simple. It's because, unfortunately, human beings get this wrong quite a lot. Because we're very visual creatures, if you're travelling fast over the ground, we tend to think we're flying fast, which is not necessarily the case. If you imagine you've got a 25 mile an hour wind and you're flying at 35 miles over the ground in the same direction, you're only actually travelling at 10 miles an hour, right very close to the stall, if not stalled at that point. And so this does catch us. If we're flying, if pilots get close to the ground and they're travelling fast, if they're not into wind, they can have very low airspeed. So we do need to understand the difference between the two. And this, of course, is why we take off and land into wind, because we can use the wind speed to minimise our ground speed whilst maintaining our airspeed. Okay, rising air. We talked about gliding flight earlier. So when you're gliding, you are always moving forwards and you are always flying down through the air, with no exceptions. However, if you're flying down through air at, say, 400 feet per minute, but that air is going up at 600 feet per minute, then obviously relative to the ground, you'll be going up at a couple of hundred feet per minute. So the key to soaring flight, having an extended flight, is to find a patch of air with a bigger vertical component than the sink rate of the glider that you're flying. So that's basically it. And that's what soaring is all about. It's just finding lifting air. Unless you use a tow line or a power unit, this is the only way to maintain height, is get a free ride from lifting air. So that's flying in rising air. Obviously the same applies if you're in sinking air. If you're sinking at 300 feet per minute and you're in air sinking at 300 feet per minute, you're going to hit the ground quite hard if you're going down at 600 feet per minute. Okay. The next thing is speed to fly and glide angle. It's fairly easy to understand. Let's go back to our straight glide down at this point. So if there's no wind and we're gliding along with an airspeed of 40 kilometers per hour, so see this diagram, and we have a glide of, let's say, 10 to 1, just for argument's sake, that's fine. Then say the wind picks up a little bit and we have a 20 kilometer per hour wind. So what happens now to our glide? Well, we're still gliding through our bit of air at 10 to 1, but at the same time, the air is moving towards us at 20 kilometers per hour. So the result is that relative to the ground, our glide is degraded significantly, 50% in this case. Okay. So the more wind that we have coming, or the more of a headwind we have to, the faster we have to fly to try and get anywhere. I mean, ultimately, to follow this through, if the wind picks up to 40 kilometers per hour, and we are flying at 40, we're just going to go down vertically. Okay, because we're flying at 40, the wind's 40. If we've got lift, we'll hover, but if we haven't got any lift, we'll just sink down vertically. And to follow this through, if the wind then picks up to 50 kilometers per hour, you know what's going to happen? We're actually going to be going backwards at 10 kilometers per hour. Still not stalled, still flying perfectly happily. The only problem with this is when you touch the ground, going backwards at 10 kilometers per hour, and it's rather difficult to control things. So that's the speed to fly and glide angle. And in order to keep a reasonable glide angle into wind, that normally means that any kind of headwind, you need to speed up in order to maximize your glide as far as you can. Okay. So that's a basic introduction to the very simplest precepts of how an aerofoil works, airspeed, ground speed and wind speed, speed to fly and so forth. So I hope you found that useful.